I'm thrilled to be able to introduce Kate Humphreys today. So several months ago, a few colleagues of mine suggested that we cover a very timely topic in our journal in some way, family separation. And I'd mentioned to my colleagues, I said, well, I think we can cover it, and I think the ideal vehicle to cover it would be through our Future Directions series. And what I did with this article that I was commissioning, I did with a lot of other topics. I'll ask my colleagues who know this area better than I do, who'd be a really great person to contact to write this paper. And our speaker, her name came up over and over and over again. So I contacted Kate to write the paper. Not surprisingly, several months later, she sends me this paper, and it's pure gold. I review it myself. I give Kate some comments, and right before I accepted it, I sent Kate an email that I got Kate's consent to read to you. Thank you so much for writing your Future Directions paper. I'm about to send a notice of acceptance to you. I wanted to send this quick note first. This is a special paper. I think in a few years, you will have early career folks coming up to your conferences. They'll thank you for writing this paper. Perhaps it put them on a path to studying family separation. Or they were already on the path and you gave them new study ideas. The paper does what the best Future Directions papers should do: inspire those who are on their way up. I also want to thank you for not just putting this paper together as quickly as you did, but also for how hard it must have been to write. You know what I mean. At times, I would read through sentences or passages and ask myself, should this be in here? Each time my answer was the same: it has to be in here. Everyone, I give you Kate Humphreys.
So thank you, Andy. That email is saved in my rainy day email box, so I can go to it when I'm having a hard time and getting grants rejected and papers rejected, and feel like, okay, sometimes things work out. So I particularly want to focus not only on the topic, which of course is very timely, but also kind of on the process of writing this paper and what it was like for me as an early career scholar to be invited to do this. So this is the paper. It's attached in the program book. When I was trying to put together the talk, I kept copying and pasting and just realizing I probably shouldn't read you the paper today. I know in some fields they do that. They just read the paper. Thankfully, we have more attractive figures and things like that. So I'm not going to read the paper. I encourage you, if you're interested, to do so. Don't tell me if there's any lingering typos, please. So that's a nice slide. Great. So here's my outline today. Kind of like, why would I be assigned to write this paper? Real world relevance, of course, as Andy was alluding to, the process of writing it, some themes and examples of the paper, and then what to do now. So I'll start with the background, education, and training. So that's me. I am a clinical psychologist by training. I started this work, this journey, being interested in why people hurt others. And when I was applying to grad school, I was talking to people who studied conduct problems, antisocial behavior across the lifespan, and kept finding that the origins were early in development. So I ended up landing in a place where I studied little kids and really starting in infancy. So thinking about how our early experiences are foundational, that many of us grow up in nurturing environments where we have caregivers who attend to our needs, but that not everyone does, and that even within people who have nurturing environments, sometimes there's often stress exposure. A lot of my clinical work in grad school was working with kids who experienced trauma. This included some Latinx kids who were separated from their caregivers during an attempt to get into the U.S. and living without their primary caregivers for a period of time. Often those journeys were stressful, and they continued to experience trauma once they got into the U.S. I also started to think about the child welfare system. So my clinical internship and postdoc was primarily working with kids who had been referred to us from child welfare services. So DCFS in Louisiana would contract with our clinic to work with the bio families and the foster families working with kids in state's care. And 75% of cases are classified as neglect in the child welfare system. So these are kids who are getting insufficient care, whether that's nutritionally, in terms of supervision, in terms of socio-emotional support. So thinking about characterizing early experiences more broadly, that's how my clinical work and my research intersected, and really tracing how those different experiences in early life may predict long-term outcomes. I had the good fortune of, you saw this slide earlier because Kate McLaughlin is also a collaborator on a study that I am fortunate to be part of. This is a picture that we often use when we illustrate the consequences of institutional care. So these are kids who are raised in rotating shifts in terms of the care providers that they see. And this is an example of how kids are not getting individualized care in these settings. They're all instructed to go to the bathroom at the same time, which is very unlike kids who are reared in families where individual needs are often sensitively responded to at the time in which they need them. So worldwide, there are over 130 million children who are orphaned, and modern societies have struggled with the best practices to care for them. Evolutionarily speaking, many kids would die who are abandoned. Fortunately, we live in a time where we've decided as societies that we want to try to provide care for these kids. However, the practices that often was made originally was institutional or orphanage-based care. In the U.S., there's very few orphanage-based care, group-based care now. Most of care is foster care. And I'll be talking a little bit about the outcomes of kids in orphanage care, and I promise I'll bring it back to parent-child separation. I really want to emphasize that these are all examples that inform our understanding of what kids need in development. That applies not only to kids who are being separated at the border from their caregivers, but kids who are being separated from their family members in the child welfare system and through death and other things as well. Okay, so kids who were raised in institutional care have growth delays, disturbances of attachment, psychopathology, deficits in IQ and executive functioning, language delays, and motor abnormalities. This is on average, and this isn't merely explained by things like nutritional deprivation. So even when these kids' instrumental care needs are met, we see these deficits over time. And in Romania in the late 20th century, there were tens of thousands of abandoned children. So these were children who were abandoned at birth or shortly after birth. And they were put into institutional care. When Ceausescu fell, there was a decision to make about what are we going to do about these kids? What's the best practice for caring for these kids? And it was in the context of trying to develop policies for informing the care of abandoned children that one of my mentors, Charlie Zena, was invited to participate in a study. So while we know that kids who were assigned to be or kids who were adopted tended to fare better than kids who remained in institutional care, it was hard to know if there was a causal link. So a lot of researchers would say, of course, being in families is better than being in an institution, but there's a selection bias. So if you are an adoptive family and you get to go pick your child, you might pick the one with dimples and who's coming up and smiling at you and able to converse with you rather than the child who's in the corner and rocking and seems to be not functioning as well. So there could be a selection bias that's responsible for the differences in prior studies that had looked at the difference between kids who are placed in families and kids who remain in orphanage care. So how do we tackle that? A randomized controlled trial. So this is a case where Chuck Nelson, Nathan Fox, and Charlie Zena, it's a study that Kate earlier spoke about, were assessed at baseline. So they were between 6 and 30 months at baseline. They had to have spent at least half of their life in institutional care. And they were randomized to either care as usual, which was no change. This did not mean assigning kids to institutions. These were kids who were already in institutional care, and they didn't interfere with their placement. So if their biological family wanted to reunite or another family wanted to foster or adopt them, they could. So it was just a regular care as usual condition versus a foster care condition. So at the time in Bucharest, there were no state-sponsored foster cares. It was seen as somewhat unusual to care for a child that wasn't biologically related to you. So they went around and tried to recruit people to be foster care providers for this study, indicating that this is, a positive thing to do. This is a kind thing to do, is to be a foster care provider. And a lot of the foster care providers that they found were adults who had adult children themselves. So they had already raised one set of kids and were open to doing this again. We had 68 kids in each condition, and we also recruited a never institutionalized group. So these were age-matched kids who were from Bucharest. And the reason we did that, of course, is to provide a baseline group, but also because many of the measures that we used were not standardized in Romanian, so we had to translate them all. And there's, of course, issues with translating measures across cultures, so this allowed us to have a baseline comparison group. We conducted assessments at baseline, age 30, 42, and 54 months, at which time the intervention officially ended and transfer of the foster care networks was assigned to the Romanian Child Protection Services. And then our study continued to conduct follow-ups at age 8, 12, and 16 years. And fingers crossed, our age 21 assessment will be coming soon. So I was lucky to come on as a postdoc when the kids were about 12 years old. And we analyzed all of our data using an intent to treat design. So this is to say, regardless of what happened to these kids over their lives, if you were assigned to the care as usual group, even if you ended up with a family, we analyze you as if you didn't get the intervention. Same with the foster care group. Whether or not you got displaced from foster care because you were reunited with your family or your foster caregiver died and you ended up back in an institution, we analyze the data as if you received the intervention. And so we also compared kids who had ever been in institutional care versus kids who had never been in institutional care. So in terms of attachment disorders, it's an area of psychopathology we haven't talked a lot about today yet. We looked at reactive attachment disorder signs and meeting criteria for this disorder, and disinhibited social engagement disorder. We also looked at internalizing and externalizing signs and disorders, and callous unemotional traits. And for each of these cases, on average, those kids who were ever institutionalized had higher levels of symptoms and disorders than kids who had never been institutionalized. What's perhaps more interesting is that in all of these cases, we saw an intent to treat effect. So this conservative approach likely underestimates the true effect of the intervention, because some of these kids didn't end up spending their time in care as usual or in prolonged institutional care or in a foster care setting. I want to focus a little bit on callous unemotional traits here because it's going to come up again. So callous unemotional traits, as most of you already know, is thought of as a precursor to psychopathy, and it's associated with lack of guilt or remorse and difficulty resonating with others' distress. We looked at this in relation to the intervention and found that on average, we see a big effect of the intervention. This was actually the first ever documented prevention of callous unemotional traits that's been found. And it was particularly true for boys. So this is where the statistically significant effect was found, and it was driven by boys. Boys who were in the care as usual condition were much more likely to have high rates or high scores of callous unemotional traits relative to the boys who were randomized to foster care. So we thought about, well, what is it about the intervention that may be preventive? And we looked to the work of character development. So thinking about the parent-child relationship as being foundational to developing a conscience. And two different kinds of parenting behavior had been pointed to previously. One is warmth, so that's praise, laughing, smiling, those positive kind of interactions that parents can give to kids. And also responsiveness to distress. So these are things like when your child is crying, holding them, comforting them, acknowledging their distress. And while these things typically are correlated, the correlation was moderate, it's about 0.3. So we put them in a mediation model. This is nice temporal ordering. So some people here have been feeling strongly about that today. So I feel good that I can show this example. And we pitted them against one another. So did the relationship between the intervention and callous unemotional traits at age 12, was it explained better by caregiver warmth or caregiver distress? And this was from an observation at age 42 months. And it was better explained by caregiver responsiveness to distress. So feeling that someone is there for you when you're distressed and can respond to you in kind seemed to be important. Now, this isn't a big surprise probably to those of you who are familiar with the work of John Bowlby and his student Mary Ainsworth. And they've greatly affected the way I've been thinking. So most of my training in graduate school didn't rely heavily on attachment theory, and it was only later that I really discovered the importance of Bowlby and Ainsworth's work and trying to say, what is it that caregivers provide? And thinking about the caregiving relationship as being so essential for development. It's not a big surprise, given the vast literature we know about the quality of caregiving, that kids who have experienced a separation from a caregiver, whether that's they were in institutional care and they never experienced a close relationship with a reliable caregiver who was committed to them, or kids who were separated because their parents went to jail or prison or died. We see for virtually every domain of psychopathology that I could find, there was an association between separation experiences and internalizing, externalizing, ADHD, attachment disorders, and PTSD. And even if you looked at kids who had no elevated risk for PTSD in that they experienced a natural disaster, which is often considered a fated kind of trauma versus the kinds of traumas that may cluster with other adverse experiences earlier in life, that even if you look at those kids who had a separation from a caregiver because of a natural disaster, we see increased risks for PTSD and PTSD symptoms that last for at least 2 years at follow-up, indicating that there's something about the separation in itself that may be traumatizing. Okay, sorry, we're working backwards. Okay, so this is my background. As you all are well aware, a zero tolerance policy was instituted by the current administration. And Dr. Colleen Kraft, who had been the president of the American Academy of Pediatrics at the time, called this government-sanctioned child abuse. And like many of you, I was horrified that this was happening, that in a rich country with resources and lots of researchers who already can say that that we shouldn't be separating children from loving and committed caregivers, that this was the practice that was being enacted. I didn't quite know what to do about it. The researchers in the BEIP group, we started emailing with one another, and from that came an op-ed that was led by Margaret Sheridan and Chuck Nelson. And it really drew on that work I was telling you before about callous unemotional traits and increased risk for externalizing as a function of being in spending your childhood without a close committed caregiver. That it was a new angle. My friend who works at the Times really helped us craft this story, which is to say, if you're the Trump administration and you're interested in keeping criminals out, which is, the stated line, this behavior is actually more likely to cause criminality over time, that the act of separating kids is likely to harm them and result in behaviors that are going to promote increased likelihood for externalizing and callous unemotional behavior going forward. So it's really counterproductive in addition to being cruel. So I got an invitation from Andy not long after this. So I was in Croatia on vacation with my family, and I was about to start my own lab. I just moved to Nashville about a year ago to start my own lab, the Stress and Early Adversity Lab. And I got this invitation from Andy. And if you can see here, it's my imposter syndrome figure, which is, what I know versus what others know, and reality. I think probably somewhere the truth is in the middle. But there's a lot of people who have more direct experience with this than I do, but at the same time, because I had this training in child welfare, and because I'd worked in the Bucharest study, I felt like I might have some information that could provide a little bit of nuance to these discussions. And so I accepted humbly and requested significant editorial guidance from Andy. So that was very helpful. So these are the points I really wanted to make, is that children have the best chance for success in the context of committed and nurturing caregivers. These are typically, though not always, children's biological parents. Despite this, the zero tolerance policy separated children from committed caregivers. And Secretary Nielsen at the time said that they were providing good care to these kids, that they were meeting their needs. And I wanted to argue, and I did, that merely surviving is insufficient, and that kids need caregivers in order to successfully develop. One horrifying consequence of the last news cycle is that we've learned that these kids in custody are not actually having their instrumental care needs met, that they're often living in environments where they have insufficient nutrition, insufficient bedding, insufficient access to physical health care. And again, that in our society that we are allowing kids to live in these situations is atrocious. It's going to have long-term impacts for their immune functioning and mental health and well-being. So I just wanted to note that I get a little worked up sometimes when I think about this. So I really think about what's happening about the kids who are separated as they're being hit with a double whammy of trauma. So one is the separation from their caregiver. And if you are in a committed, attached relationship with your caregiver, losing that caregiver in your life is a trauma. Secondly, whatever conditions you're in, if you don't have that trusted caregiver to support you and help you navigate those difficult experiences afterwards, you're left regulating by yourself. And that's yet again another trauma, is not having a species expected caregiver to help make sense of the distressing experiences you have post-separation. Okay, so now that I've said that, I want to point to some complexities in this area, because I keep thinking about this as on the one hand and on the other. And a lot of the sound bites that we would give to the media say things that I think are true, but there's always also an asterisk. So I wanted to just run through those a little bit here. So separation causes harm, absolutely. But we can't trace all of the impacts that we're seeing to the separation, that often pre-separation events are harmful. For people who are making a very difficult and arduous journey to get to our border, it's often not a cakewalk. And so pre-separation experiences that led them to seek refuge in the US, as well as that journey, may have also been traumatic. Children belong with their caregivers. That's on the one hand. On the other, some caregivers are not safe. And so I can't say we should never separate kids from their parents, because sometimes that's the only thing that will keep that child alive. So I just want to acknowledge that there are some very difficult decisions that have to be made that often might involve removing a child from their biological parent. Children need swift placements into families. Absolutely. The longer they're in group-based care, the worse it is for them. That being said, we know that stable, long-term, permanent placements are better than short-term placements. So work from the foster care world in the US often finds that kids who've moved repeatedly have more difficulties than kids who find a stable home that's long-term. So brain plasticity may mean that there's increased vulnerability to separation at younger ages, But also I want to say that plasticity affords the opportunity for growth and recovery, so that even though we say that kids are traumatized because of this, doesn't mean that we can't capitalize on that plasticity to promote recovery. So as a related point, children recover from injury, absolutely. But just because you recover doesn't mean the injury is acceptable. So just because you can heal from a broken leg doesn't mean I should break your leg, right? Okay, and that group-based care meets children's survival needs. It does, but again, survival is insufficient. And of course, as we've been learning recently, the group-based care that's been provided in some agencies at the border have not been sufficient. Okay, so what are some themes and examples I want to point to about the future of research in parent-child separation? Which is, of course, it's complex. Like anything, the further you go, the deeper you get, the more complex you realize things are. So there are varieties of parent-child separation. Of course, there are immigration-related separations, as I've been alluding to, but there's also separations of different quantities and different magnitudes. And one of the examples I listed in the paper is that, this is a personal example, but my husband has been a resident and a fellow for a long time, and my kids didn't see a lot of him. So technically, they're not separated from him, but the kind of contact that they had over their childhood has been different than they have had with me. So that's just one example of thinking about how we might think about these things as on a continuum rather than a yes or no situation. That there are difficulties with causal inference. Just because a child is having difficulties doesn't mean we know what was the cause of them. And we can't randomly assign people to experience separation. Of course, we shouldn't. But it does make it more difficult. We have to rely on things like non-human animal research to help us better understand what might be the long-term consequences and short-term consequences of separation. And there are definitional and informant issues. So when is someone considered separated from their caregiver? How long does the separation need to be? And who's determining whether it's a separation or not? So these things are constant in all of our work, thinking about how do we define things. So this is a very simplistic model that I put up just to try to think about how separation may be predictive of child's mental health and functioning. Is to consider pre-separation experiences, the circumstances of separation. Is it a removal from an abusive caregiver? Is it separation by government officials at the border? Those might have different consequences for the child. And what's the post-separation placement like? Are they with other trusted relatives? Are they in a group-based home? What's the quality of that care and what's the stability of that care? So things that I recommended doing include considering how best to model stress. So stressors are not randomly assigned. Unfortunately, people who experience a lot of stress are more likely to experience stress later in life. And so it's hard to parse what is responsible. If you want to know causality, it's difficult to do, and you have to have careful ways to model it. I wanted to point out the importance of attachment disruption as a stress in itself, so that if you're separated from a caregiver you have a secure attachment to, it's likely to be worse than if it's a caregiver you weren't close with or hadn't developed an attachment relationship with. Thinking about the pre-separation, the separation, the post-separation experiences as being interactive and maybe being multiplicative in their impact. To consider covariates carefully. This is something that we often receive various training on whether and how to consider covariates. It's something that I think is probably better for the post-talk discussion. And then making use of quasi-experiments. So one example I give is that just like when we were talking about schools, every school is a different fiefdom, every child welfare system is a different fiefdom. So that different counties, different states have different policies for what would be the threshold for removing a child from their family and returning a child to their family. And that we could make use of this through studies that compare kids in similar demographic backgrounds but happen to be on different sides of a county line, and looking at the long-term consequences of the threshold of removal and return with families over time. And this is an example of an everyday child welfare dilemma. So parents who are struggling with substance use disorders should be given an opportunity to rehabilitate and meet the needs of their children. That's not that debatable. But the question is, how long should we wait? How long should the child be in limbo wondering if their parent is going to be able to be their permanent caregiver? Given the plasticity of the developing brain, we're racing against the clock in terms of forming attachment relationships and providing a stable home. And so the goal of family unity, on the one hand, could result in prolonged suffering of children exposed to unpredictable and increased risk to maltreatment. I don't have the answer to this, but it is something that's a difficult situation to try to wonder, how do we balance these different priorities? Okay, so in my advice for what we should be thinking about next, I wanted to emphasize the importance of sensitive periods. Given the importance of attachment processes in early life, sensitive periods may be particularly relevant to the study of parent-child separations. So as most of you already know, a sensitive period is a time in development when the brain is primed for specific kinds of input from an expectable environment at certain times. And that development can be derailed if the timing is off or the input is excessive or abnormal. I wanted to show this as an example in some recent work I did, which is really looking at the developing brain and pointing out that in terms of the hippocampus, a brain region that Kate McLaughlin talked about earlier, that we see rapid growth in the hippocampus in the first 5 years of life. And we tried to put this into context with the study that I worked on in my postdoc with Ian Gottlieb, where we brought in a number of adolescents and we interviewed them about traumatic events that they may have experienced. We asked them about 31 different events that had happened to them. And for each one, an objective panel rated the stress severity of each event from a 0, which is a mild stress, to a 3.5, which is a severe stress here. And so again, this wasn't by the type of stress, it was about the severity of stress, because even within type, there can be great severity differences. We also asked for the age of onset for each stressor. And we used this to say, is there a relationship between the child's worst stress in terms of severity score and hippocampal volume measured in adolescence? And here we looked specifically at stressors that occurred in the first 5 years of life. And we found a significant negative association between, greater stress severity was associated with smaller hippocampal volume. We then said, well, maybe this is related to stressors they experience later. As you know, as I mentioned, stressors are correlated over time. If you've experienced a severe stress early in life, you probably have experienced severe stressors later. And we did find that to be true. And so when we isolated just later stressors, though, we found no association. And the original finding for that early life stress severity held even when we covaried for stress severity experienced at age 6 and older. Now, again, this is not randomized, we can't assign, but it speaks to the possibility that there's a sensitive period for the effects of stress and trauma on hippocampal volume, which is a very important brain region for memory and emotion. I won't talk a lot about mechanisms, although that's where a lot of the exciting work is now, as Greg talked about and Kate talked about, thinking about mechanisms, and Phil's talk included mechanisms too, so everybody here is thinking about mechanisms, which is great. These are just a few that I've been thinking about, but please feel free to add your own. And this is, I think, an important area for future research on how does experiences of separation from a caregiver result in potential negative outcomes. Another point that I wanted to mention was adolescence as a sensitive period. So this is something that came up in one of the discussions earlier about a growing belief and some data now that support that adolescence may be an additional period of increased plasticity that we might be able to harness to intervene during this period to make positive changes. I just want to speak to some data that supports the idea that that development doesn't end in early life. So even though I'm an infant mental health psychologist, I have to acknowledge that things that happen after infancy and early life still matter. So here's again some data from the Bucharest Early Intervention Project. What we did was then we split this middle group of foster care. We broke intent to treat. We did it intentionally. We still analyzed it during intent to treat. So those of you who want to point to that, we have the data both ways. But what we did was we looked at whether kids who were assigned to foster care and stayed in that foster care placement versus kids who were assigned to foster care but were disrupted from that placement may differ in their adolescent psychopathology outcomes. Now, for those of you who say, well, probably the kids who were really difficult were more likely to be disrupted, I think that's a plausible theory. we did the best we could to try to see if that might be true. We looked to see whether at the end of the intervention, which is at age 54 months, these two groups of kids differed in terms of their IQ, in terms of their number of psychiatric symptoms, and the percent of time they spent in institutional care. And there were no differences between these groups, which doesn't make the case, but it helps us to better argue that if we see differences in their outcomes in adolescence, it's due to the disruption rather than due to pre-existing differences. So just showing our data the regular way, this is at age 16 outcomes. This is a paper under review right now, which is we see that for those kids who are never placed in institutional care, their rates of meeting criteria for any disorder are about 13, which is consistent with epidemiological studies in the US. Kids who are randomized to foster care group have higher rates on average of disorder, and kids who are in the care as usual group have the highest. So we have an ever versus never institutionalized effect here, and we also have an intervention effect. So these are group differences between the foster care and the care as usual. And when I split it in the way I was just describing, so foster care stable versus foster care disrupted, we see a pattern that really indicates that the kids who are stably placed look about the same in terms of rates of psychopathology than the never institutionalized comparison children, whereas the kids who experience disruption look nearly as bad in terms of their psychopathology outcomes as kids who are in the care as usual condition, which points to us to say that the importance of long-term committed placements over time, and that just putting kids and families in early life is not going to be enough. Okay, I wanted to acknowledge here briefly the cultural and political context. As I said in the paper, which is probably what Andy was talking about, that maybe this shouldn't go in, but maybe it should, is that a president who calls Mexicans rapists can't be trusted to make decisions that are unbiased about certain groups of people. And so I think it's important to pay attention to who's being victimized and the urgency of the reunions, the placement and the types of care kids are getting, that it's very dehumanizing, and that there are cultural and political factors that are worth considering here. So stepping away from that, I just want to think about what is it that kids need? What is a caregiver providing? And so this is work that I worked on with Ian Gottlieb and Lucy King, and it's really thinking about measurement. And that's thinking about deprivation to enrichment as being on a continuum, and healthy development being here on the y-axis. And most studies have looked at institutional care or child welfare groups using that orange threshold model. You experienced neglect, you didn't. Now that's given us a lot of important information about the harmful effects of neglect, but it's unlikely to represent the true reality of experiences. So I put in some other models here that we might be able to test and provide support or refutation from, which is a linear model here in green, or what I think is most likely is a diminishing returns model, which is that the per increment gain that you get from each sort of hour of quality care is going to be more at the low end than at the high end. So if you're used to spending 0 hours with a caring and nurturing caregiver, 1 hour is going to make a big difference. But if you're used to spending 14 hours, that 1 extra hour is probably not going to make as big of a difference. And then thinking further about enrichment as being multidimensional. So thinking about emotional input, that nurturance piece we've been hearing about, versus cognitive input. So we often think about this in terms of stimulation, reading, talking, things like that. And there's some evidence from other groups that find that stimulation in terms of adult word count is associated with positive outcomes in kids, including vocabulary at age 24 months. And we didn't know if the same parents who are going to be talking a lot to their kids, having enriching conversations, would also be the kind of sensitive, nurturing caregivers. And thinking about how do we model this? So we created a theoretical model that we filled with our hypothesized correlations between these things. So cognitive input here, emotional input here, and how sensitively it's delivered. So I'll give you an example of that. If your child is sitting comfortably and you run up and say, "I'm going to give you a big hug, I love you so much," that can be very warm, but insensitively delivered, right? You want to match where your child is in terms of what they need. So we hypothesized this. We then said, okay, what data do we have that can speak to this? So we have a bunch of 6-month-olds and their moms who've come into our lab, and we did a still face procedure, which is a structured procedure where parents interact with their child for 2 minutes. For 2 minutes, they have a still face. They have a reunion for 2 minutes. We do the repeated version where we do another 2 minutes of still face and then a second reunion. And through that, we do microcoding, which is the amount of time the mom is touching the baby. That's our measure of warmth. And we also have a descriptive code, so it's a 1 to 7 scale of sensitivity using the Pew Series. And we also had kids go home and spend 2 days wearing the Lena, in which we got the number of adult words on average the child experienced at home as our measure of cognitive input. And our data indicated that these things were not actually correlated with one another. We really thought they would be, but maternal touch was not associated with the number of adult words per hour on average. And maternal sensitivity was not associated with maternal touch. And if anything, there was a slight negative, but not statistically significant association between sensitivity and adult words per hour. And our real data looked like this in terms of our 3D model. They weren't correlated with one another. And it led you to question, what's the experience of this child who has high levels of sensitive emotional input but relatively lower levels of cognitive input versus this child who experienced moderate levels of emotional and cognitive input, but they might not be very sensitively delivered, and thinking about these as being unique contributors. We also started to think about targets for parenting interventions. If we wanted to improve caregiving experiences, what would be our target? And thinking about cognitive and emotional processes at the level of the caregiver that might be predictive of these things. And we found that mothers' reports of personal distress when her child is distressed was associated with reduced touch. So this is similar to what Paul Bloom might say is empathy interfering with appropriate compassionate behavior. We also found that maternal perspective taking was associated with increased adult words per hour. So being able to take your child's perspective may be predictive of how much you talk to your child. And thinking about measurement at home, as I mentioned, most of our data comes from institutional care. And I applied for a grant to the Jacobs Foundation with Kate McLaughlin to try to do a better job at measuring what's really happening at home. And so in order to do this, we started thinking about putting devices on babies and caregivers to measure the distance between them over time. So this is a real-time measurement using time-of-flight data of their distance from one another. So this is work that I could not do on my own. I just want to acknowledge I am not an engineer, but we have some great engineers at Berkeley who've been helping us with this task. My fantastic postdoc, Virginia Salo, has been really spearheading this project in our lab. And we've been creating these things called TOT tags. This is the name that Andreas came up with. And these are wearable devices that measure time of flight distance. The watch there is just there for scale, so you can see that it's actually wearable. We've created vests, just like those Lena vests you might have seen, where we can put the device right on a child's chest. We have a second pocket for the Lena so that we can look at the relationship between physical proximity and stimulation in terms of adult word count. And adults can wear them in their pockets. So the idea is that close contact would indicate likelihood for stimulating or nurturing experiences. More distal contact might mean that the caregiver's in the same home or building, but not directly interacting with the child. Because they're portable, we can get them on the go wherever the parent and child are. So if they're in the car or the grocery store, it would still be assessing this. And that we made it so you can't, it's not just mom and baby, as in this example, but it can be every member of the family or whomever cares for the child. So I want to go through one example. Somebody said whose kids are going to be permanent study participants, like mine are. So that's my son, and that's my husband. He did not want to be pulled into this, but he's in it, yes. So we did something called the strange situation procedure here. And so I'm going to show a video of it. It's going to be sped up, so it's not going to be the full 10 minutes. And what you have on the bottom is our measurements that we're getting from these proximity devices. So on the low end is close contact, so 0 is 0 feet. On the top end is 14 feet, and on the y-axis here is time. So at the beginning of the strange situation, it's a free play. We instructed the dad to sit on the chair to have some baseline measurements of distance between them. And because we can show you ahead of time, you can anticipate what might be happening next in the video. Well, yes, and he's very cute. So my project coordinator comes into the room, and he's not sure about her. Right? He doesn't know her. He goes in and checks in with Dad. And this kind of proximity seeking is all part of normative attachment behavior, that you seek proximity when you're nervous, and then when you feel comfortable, you go back out and explore. Those of you who are interventionists who use circle of security, this will be familiar to you. So he's gained a little comfort, he's going back out, and he's exploring the rest of the lab space. So he's getting more comfortable with the stranger as long as Dad is there. Stranger gets on the floor to play with him, and he's not so sure again. He wants to go check in with Dad. Dad's his safe space. Dad's his attachment base. He checks in. He gets some comforting, and then he comes back out. He's okay. Dad's kind of filled his emotional cup, as we might say. Okay, Dad leaves. He's very distressed. He tries to seek comfort from the stranger. It's not working. Dad comes back in. He reunifies. They're close contact again. So, this is just a laboratory-based example of how we might be able to validate these kinds of measures. We think these things are happening all of the time for young kids, where they seek comfort from their caregiver and then they go out again. This is Winslow wore it all day. That's my son. And I wore the other one. And this is just our measurements throughout the day. So you can have really rich data of the kinds of coming in and coming out that happen. The low bars there are just nap times where I left my device in the room with him. And you can see that those periods of close contact are punctuated by just... Exactly. But we're working with a data visualization scientist to help us make meaning of these different patterns of interaction over time. Okay, so what are the take-home messages that I want to make today? Children benefit from high-quality, stable family care with a committed adult. Particularly early in life, infants and young children are entirely dependent on caregivers to provide them with stimulation and nurturance and to protect them from harm, to meet their survival needs. And although there are moral, political, and cultural reasons to be examining the effects of parent-child separation today, for decades, as researchers, we've really been trying to tackle this problem of how should society support children without parental care. There are hundreds of thousands of children in the U.S. who are currently in foster care, and there are an estimated 140 million orphans worldwide. So what do we do now? I don't have the answers, I'm just telling you that. But I will say that scientists have a strong inclination to share our results. We're not doing this to talk to ourselves. It's great that we're all here and talking to each other, but our hopes are that our work is going to be informative for other people who are making decisions and need the data that we are generating. The ability for science to influence parent-child separation hasn't been established in this case. People have really been speaking out about the zero-tolerance policy. Technically, they've canceled it, although when I've talked to reporters, they're saying there's still separations happening all the time at the border. As a illustrative example of when science may have been helpful, the Romanian government passed a law in 2005 banning the institutionalization of children under age 24 months. This was shortly after the Bucharest team presented their findings that kids who were placed before 24 months had greater gains in IQ than kids who were placed later after that. So there is some reason to think that policymakers who are trying to make decisions might listen to the research that we're generating to help inform their decisions. A number of people have written op-eds, have spoken out about the dangers of separating children from parents. These are just some examples. I want to point to some advocates that you can follow on Twitter if you're interested, or going to their websites. This is not an exhaustive list, but just some people to potentially pay attention to. Kate McLaughlin as well wrote an op-ed yesterday, which Jen Silvers published in the Washington Post. So there are scientists who are trying to disseminate what we know to inform the public about the dangers of separating kids from committed and loving caregivers. If you want to be active or donate money, these are agencies that I would recommend, particularly RACES and ACLU. I am practicing what I preach there, but I encourage you to, if you feel moved, to try to get engaged or try to donate your money if you have it. I wanted to say thank you to my funding sources, NIMH, Jacobs, Brain and Behavior Foundation, Klingenstein, to my wonderful lab who have taken a lot of trust in joining a new PI and who's bitten off probably more than she can chew in doing this work in our lab, and to my mentors, Steve Lee, Nim Tottenham, Charlie Zena, and Ian Gottlieb, and the collaborators whose work I included in this presentation. So thank you. Oh, and to Andy.
Kate has officially the most awesome lab name, because I don't know if you all are fans of Adult Swim, but C-Lab 2020 is fantastic. Any questions?
So I used to work at the Utah State Hospital, which is an institution where they have people of all ages, and I worked with 6th grade kids which were taken from their families because they were either a harm to themselves or others and placed in this institution. And they attended school there and were there for the most part and had some time out with their families on maybe an occasional weekend or so. And I'm wondering, now that's supposed to be for their benefit, to help them improve their mental health before they go back to their families. But I can see there could be a lot of pros and cons with that situation. Do you have anything to say, like, have you ever done any research to examine how those two things could play out, the benefits from the program, but the possible cons from taking them away from their families in that situation?
I haven't conducted research specifically on that. My guess would be that keeping kids in close contact with their caregivers is preferable. Ideally, they're able to live at home or have regular visitation by their caregivers during their stay. We also have some reason to think that regular phone calls for older kids with their caregivers may have some of the same benefits as being in the same room. In general, I think there's some lip service that we know that caregivers are important, but I think one of the things I'm noticing is that there's a shift towards wanting to treat the child as if they're not part of a broader context, and how supportive and necessary caregivers are to supporting their kids' transition, and that a lot of our work really should be to help kids in their regular context to meet their needs, and that might mean supporting families where they are.
Thanks for your talk. I thought it was really moving and brave, a lot of the stuff that you said. But some of the counterpoints that people say about the parent-child separation at the borders, we're already kind of doing it within our U.S. criminal justice system with parental incarceration or even juvenile justice detention centers. Is there kind of research that you saw within the parent-child separation field that looks at those types of separation to kind of study that?
So one of the points that I hope came across was that stressors are not, they don't occur independently. So I think my first priority is for kids to be in a safe, committed caregiving relationship, and that sometimes it is for their benefit to be removed from their biological family of origin. There are decisions that are made that are on the border. And so things like, should women who are pregnant in prison be able to keep their child with them after they give birth, or should the child live in an unconfined setting? I think it's hard to speak definitively about the pros and cons of that. I mean, we know that there are advantages to being with someone who's committed to you. There are disadvantages to being confined to a cell all day long. So for each of these things, I think it's probably going to be hard to generate the data, but we can look for opportunities as scientists to better inform these decisions with real data about practices that might vary based on states or based on counties or based on country.
There was a special issue in Attachment and Human Development about parent-child relationships in the context of parental incarceration, really suggesting that keeping kids with parents, especially nonviolent offenders who are largely incarcerated for drug use, showing that there's real benefit to keeping kids with their parents. So I think it was 2009 or so that the special issue came out that I'd encourage people to take a look at.
Thanks, Katie.
So I'm one of 3 boys, and I was just wondering about, oh, that was really loud, sibling separation, just because I feel like that's another area that could really, like, I don't know, too much about, the foster system, but I know that there's sometimes, if there's child or a certain age that maybe they will be separated depending on, living scenarios. What do you make of that? Like, is there like an age threshold that sibling separation can cause psychological harm, or that before then, if the child is separated from a sibling and isn't raised with them, that it could not be influential?
I don't know of any studies that specifically looked at that question. I do know that Davy Moran has written papers about whether children who have been living in different foster care families should be reunited for the sake of having siblings live together. If I'm remembering correctly, their argument was that disrupting children from secure attachment relationships they develop with their foster families would potentially not justify the benefits of living with a sibling they hadn't met. I think it's a harder case when it's someone that you've lived with and grown up with and have developed strong relationships with. Again, these are the complexities that make it really hard to know what to advise, and we just don't have a lot of good data on that yet.
Hi, thank you for your amazing work and courage in putting this together. I'm looking forward to reading your paper. I have not yet. And in doing so, one of the things that I'll probably have, circulating in my mind, and maybe you can prevent me from, ruminating on this, is the issue of culture and the extent to which, we might be thinking about other cases that might be similar in terms of separation, whether it's the foster care system or just kids who have been abandoned or in prison. I mean, all of these examples that have been provided as, potentially informative. But then there's the cultural piece and the cultural values that these families bring with them into the host, in quotation, the host culture or the host country where they're seeking, refugee status, for example. Could you talk about that a little bit, maybe? Have you, I'm not sure how much you wrote about it on your paper, but, perhaps you could speak about it a bit?
What's the question exactly?
The culture. The role of culture here, for these kiddos, the ones being separated at the border. I
will have to join you in your rumination. I don't have a good answer for that. One of my hesitations about writing about this is that I'm white. Most of my clinical experiences have been with communities of color, and I always try to acknowledge that I only have my own experience to build from, but that I want to better understand the experiences that they've had that have led them to experience the world that they see it. And for the families in LA that I would often see, there was a interest in getting to the U.S. first, and then worrying about the trauma that it took to get there later, recovering later from that, and often because there was a fear that being involved in mental health services or school services might alert the authorities to know that there might be undocumented individuals in the family, could result in likelihood of seeking those support services. So that's something I'm aware of, but I haven't studied specific cultural differences in either rates of psychopathology or rates of treatment seeking, things like that. But I welcome what you're thinking and sharing that with the group.
Thank you. Speaking as an immigrant, refugee, right, who is now privileged for having had the opportunity to earn a PhD and do something with it in this country, I'd like to respond to one of the things that you said, and that is we need white people writing about this. So don't, if I may say, that's something that is important, and rather than, oh, I am a white woman or a white man writing about this, so my voice is not as important. In fact, it is very, very important, and it's crucial that somebody like me with my background and my accent is not the only person talking about this. So that's one piece. The other piece that comes to mind, thank you, Deb. The other piece that comes to mind is that conceptually, theoretically, we know that these families are very, very emotionally connected, that levels of warmth are very high, that the culture promotes, for lack of a better word, some degree of like functional enmeshment. And when we pull them apart, and when they separate, because there are separations that happen down there where kids might be separating from their parents and then being sent over here with an aunt and an older sibling who is being in charge of like taking care of them, or at least getting them to the border, and then at that point, then they get separated again, and then they might continue to get separated. So that's like one group of people. The other group of people that some might not be aware of is folks that come through the border, and then some of us know that there's a group here and there, and then we get a phone call about where to go pick them up with a jug of milk and some donuts, and where to drop them off so that somebody can pick them up again and get them a bus pass and then send them to some other state where there might be a relative or a friend who can take care of. So those things are happening already. And so there's like different samples here from this cohort of folks that have come in. And then there's like the different ideas or reasons as why they came. So not only the culture, but the social and contextual factors, whether it is, through like economic, hardships or political persecution in their countries, or, whatever it might be. And some of those people some of them are not even fluent in Spanish. And, they come from indigenous groups and societies, and they don't really speak the language. So this idea that, they should know what's going on in this country and what's going to happen when they get to the border, that's not really true. What they're hearing is that things are changing, so if you're going to get out, this is the time to get out, so let's just rush and let's just try to get there. So I think that as we move forward and try to study these factors, the point is the role of, these social cultural factors is going to be very important in terms of understanding the degree of severity that comes from the separation and the recovery, the rapid recovery that some folks might, experience through these processes. And it sort of like brings me back, or I tend to think about the Peter Pan Project. And I don't know, if you're familiar with that, but, those separations were very different from this. But again, kiddos were separated from their parents, put in planes, and then shipped to this country to be taken care by the Archdiocese of Miami. And then very quickly, they were put in homes with relatives and neighbors and cousins that, worked with them and nurtured them. So we already did this in the 60s, and I'm sure that it's happened many other times. There are social political reasons why we're here now.
Yeah.
So again, thank you, and keep talking.
discussion now, right?
No, that's great. I appreciate it. Yeah.